Uh, Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight as we continue our series. It is on. As we continue to explore the political framework of what is happening in Russia at the moment. And some of you might have been here last week as part of this series to talk about the sanctions and the implications of sanctions in Russia. And some of you may have been to quite recent talk with Roderick Braithwaite and Bridget Kendall, talking about sort of myths that are built in the perception of Russian history. And tonight we're very honored to be having two outstanding experts here. Laurie Bristow, who was a former ambassador of the UK in Russia, and Julie Newton from Oxford College, who will tell us what kind of future we're looking at. Thank you, if any at all. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you and good evening. And first of all, thank you very much from both of us for the invitation to come and talk this evening. I'm afraid I should give a warning right at the outset. Certainly what I'm going to say is not going to be very optimistic. I think there are some points where you have to face the facts in order to correctly ground your discussion about where things go from here. So what we thought we'd do is between us talk for probably 45, 50 minutes in the form of a semi-structured discussion, and then at the end of that throw it open to questions, comments from the floor. The loose structure that we're working on is, well, actually when I came back from Moscow in 2020, I had in my head the idea of a book, the working title of which was, How Did We Get Here and Where Are We Going? The problem with that title, of course, is that you can spend plenty of time arguing about how we got here, but where we are going seems to me to be harder and more troubling by the day. And of course, even as you're writing, the problem is moving away from you. First of all, I'll start off with a few reflections on how did we get here. So the path to war, but to go back a bit further than that. So I spent large amounts of the last 15 years or so in Moscow. I was deputy ambassador there during the Georgia invasion in 2008. I've dealt with 2 poisonings and 3 invasions. I'm sorry to put it in those terms, but I found myself once saying in a meeting in Whitehall in London, if this surprises you, you have not been paying attention. That was, I'm afraid, after the Salisbury attack, where, as you remember, the GRU used a nerve agent against Sergei Skripal, a former GRU officer. So some of the salient features, I think, to focus on here. So, a place to start is Mr. Putin's very strange historical essay from July 2021, setting out his view on the history of Russia and Ukraine. And I'll just pick out a few quotes, from that essay. And it's important to understand the scale of the issue that we're dealing with here. So I quote Putin's essay. Modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era, shaped for a significant part on the lands of historical Russia. Russia was robbed. Ukraine is an anti-Russia project. This, I think, it sets the scene in terms of both the conceptual underpinning, but also the emotion, the anger, the boiling hate, resentments in there that are part of the decision to go to war. So through 2021, we saw actually several military build-ups. There was a huge military build-up, and then it went back again, and then an even bigger military build-up, where, as you'll remember, US and UK intelligence services were saying, actually, he's going to do this, and most of the rest of the world was saying, I don't think so. I'll come back in a little bit to some of the issues there. Right at the end, we had put in front of us 2 draft treaties. I read those treaties, as I'm sure many of you did. My view on them is that they were not even meant to be negotiable. I mean, they clearly were not negotiable. Essentially, you're talking about winding the clock back to a large extent, not only to the end of the Cold War, but requiring a completely different approach to European security and effectively, in some respects, US withdrawal from European security. That was simply not going to happen, and no serious analyst in Moscow, I think, would believe that. I tend to think of those treaties as similar in some ways, but further gone to the 2007 Munich speech. So better understood as an insight into what's going on in the minds, the mentality of those people. What are the emotional as well as the policy factors in play for them? And again, something we might come back to in the discussion. It's about the role of emotion in the making of politics and foreign policy. I think we tend to talk as if we're all rational actors. We're not. None of us is. So I mentioned a bit earlier, some of the other patterns of behavior. People debate where the current crisis in Ukraine began. I would put it at no later than 2004, actually, not even 2014. I think the roots of this crisis lie in the things that produced the Orange Revolution, the dysfunctions in the Ukraine-Russia relationship. It's a terrible path from there to where we got to in February last year, but there is a path. Georgia 2008, I was in Moscow at the time, but also the wider national security challenges. So I dealt with the aftermath of the Litvinenko killing, the attempt on Sergei Skripal's life, which of course killed an entirely innocent bystander. Her name is Dawn Sturgess, and we should not allow her to be airbrushed out of history here. Also, of course, active measures, information warfare, you name it. And there's another side of the coin. It's the efforts made after the end of the Cold War in particular to build a different sort of relationship, primarily with Russia, but also with the countries of the region. I have in mind here the expansion of the G7 to form the G8. No objective economic basis to do that, but that was not the point. The point was to build a different sort of political relationship with Moscow. The NATO-Russia relationship. A lot of effort, a lot of work went into building a more cooperative, if not an entirely cooperative, relationship with Russia in parallel to what was happening around NATO enlargement and the path to that. The NATO-EU relationship. So when I arrived in Moscow in 2008, 2007, we had an EU-Russia agreement with 4 common spaces. That's all gone, and the underlying logic of it is gone. We tried to build cooperative security and economic relationships really across the board. So the next, I think, thing that I should touch on is what went wrong. Clearly, a lot of things went very seriously wrong over a very long period of time. We'll all have our own list. I think the key points for me, I will put out there NATO enlargement. It's clearly a very large part of the resentments in Moscow. I don't think it's anything like as simple as NATO enlargement caused Russia to behave as it did. I think that's an infantile way of looking at the problem, and it absolutely does not absolve the Kremlin from the decisions it took. But I was in Moscow the night of the Bucharest decision in 2008. My take on that decision is that this is a pretty bad way to deal with this, because you're not doing one thing and you're not doing the other. Choose one and see it through, but what you don't do is try and split the difference. And I was talking that evening at a party to everyone in the room will know the person, but I won't name him, a Russian analyst. He said, this means war. And I sort of burst out laughing and said, come on, don't be silly, be serious. He said, no, this means war. And then he explained why. The EU relationship, it's important to keep reminding ourselves that the trigger for 2014, for the Maidan and for what happened, was not the Ukraine-NATO relationship, it was the Ukraine-EU relationship. And the flip-flopping under pressure from Moscow of the Yanukovych regime about what kind of country Ukraine wanted to be, and the things that followed from that. So I'll push it a bit further. I think there's also something going on in the background about the rules-based international system. So I can name this person. I think the last time I saw Sergei Lavrov, he told me directly in these terms, there is no such thing as the rules-based international system. You people made it up for your own purposes. And again, it was saying, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the UN Charter and the body of mutual obligations, the institutions, the Security Council, the General Assembly, organizations that you have joined and that we've supported you joining, like the World Trade Organization. But of course, the point here is that we're using the same words to mean completely different things. And just to explain a little bit what I mean by that. So liberal interventionism. When we intervened in countries like Kosovo, for example, or in the former republics of Yugoslavia, we told ourselves that we were preventing genocide, for example, or major war crimes. I think it was understood in Moscow as regime change. So the point here is to, I'll come on a little bit, and this is, I think, the main point that we're going to discuss now. It's how you can look at the same things and understand them in different ways and draw different conclusions from them. This, I'm afraid, is becoming a more and more material fact in dealing with Moscow. So I'll finish in a minute and hand over to Julie to react to some of that. The conclusion I came to during my time in Moscow is that we have a real piece of work on our hands, which is to try to understand the worldview of a man like Mr. Putin and the people around him. This is absolutely not to excuse it. I want to make this absolutely crystal clear. I think that what Putin has done in Ukraine is inexcusable. It is inhumane. It is a war crime. It is a war of aggression. And they will need to account for that in due course. But if we don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, we're not going to be able to make effective policy. What I'm particularly interested in exploring is how do those people understand what happened, particularly in 1989 to 91, what caused the Soviet Union to break up, what caused those countries, particularly Ukraine, to decide that they wanted a different destiny from that of Russia. In my view, I think that's closely linked also with their understanding of what happened before, during, and after 1945. So the world that emerged from the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, and what they understand as Russia's entitlements in that. And I think they are under entitlements as a great power. And within that also, I think there's a cognitive dimension. So ghastly though it is, trying to think yourself into the mind of a late Soviet KGB man. So a man whose formative experiences were in the KGB, trying to get into the KGB in Dresden as the German Democratic Republic fell to pieces, scrabbling around in St. Petersburg in the 1990s, and then the emergence from the 90s into what happened after that. And again, to spell out some things that are unpleasant to contemplate, I think there is an issue here about a conspiratorial mindset, Mrakabesia, all our old favorite friends, how those sorts of people look at the world. But there are also some things here about how you understand stability, how you understand legitimacy. Where does it come from? What happens when it's in question? How do you deal with change, societal change, global and in the wider world? And I think the most important, almost the single question in Russian politics for some years now, how do you deal with a transfer of power? And regeneration, generational change when the time comes, which it clearly is now happening. So I'll pause there and I think hand over to Julie to tell me what I've got wrong on that, but what's your take on all of this?
Thank you, Laurie. In fact, one of the nice things about Laurie and me is that we tend to agree on a lot. And it's interesting because bridging the gap here between academia and policy, I think it's quite nice because you're very policy-minded, but you're also very academically minded. I mean, you're interested in the kind of academic reflections and the longer-term reflections that a lot of policymakers don't have time for. But I think it makes a nice. It's as a result, it's a real pleasure to be able to discuss these kinds of things with you, to have the policy dimension that we often don't get in our academic discussions. But I really am glad that we're starting with how did we get here, because even in mediation, I'm working right now with a British mediator who's worked a lot in Africa, who works a lot in the UN, Matthew Waldman, who says that they always start when they begin to mediate with this question of each other's narratives of how did this conflict come about, that you really can't begin to solve a conflict until you lay out the different narratives of how did we get here. So I'm quite pleased that that's where we're starting off too. And it's interesting, not only are there competing narratives about how did we get here between Russia and West, within the West, there are very different very competing narratives too. And I just want to lay out some of these narratives and then offer my own, which I think dovetails quite nicely with yours, Laurie. But on the one side, you do have these hardcore structural realists in the West, those like John Mearsheimer, who maybe some of you know, and also many in the Russian foreign policy elite that say it's all the West's fault. This is all about NATO enlargement. This is all about EU enlargement without taking any Russian interest at heart. It's all about security, 100%. That's quite a simplistic view. I mean, it's a simplistic caricature of this, but that's essentially that narrative. It's security all the way down. On the other side, there is the opposite. It's all Russia's fault. That that Russia has an imperialist core, that they have always it's historically predetermined, that it's in Russia's genetic code, this exceptionalist mindset, the authoritarian nature of the regime drives them to this kind of imperial behavior, and we are one people with Ukraine that Laurie mentions. So this this expansionist behavior is inevitable in this case, right? So both of those are very black and white narratives. It's all structurally predetermined by on the one hand, the structural realists say this, or the Russians say it's all. But they also, by the way, structural realism is the dominant school of international relations thinking among a lot of Russian foreign policy thinkers with whom I spent an awful lot of time until February 24th, 2022. But these narratives are oversimplified. They're oftentimes very narrow, and they're only part of the story. I mean, of course, the nature of a regime matters. Of course, the structure of the international system matters. But on their own, these very simplistic narratives that you see in the press a lot, particularly now, it's all Russian imperialism, they don't really help us understand what's happened. The third narrative to which I subscribe is much more of a complex mix. It's an action-reaction dynamic that it's fueled by events, a mindset, different mindsets, emotions, as Laurie says, and the interplay of emotions over 3 decades. And this action-reaction dynamic takes place on both sides. It's the interaction between the two. And if you had a graph with the y-axis and the x-axis, in 1989, 1991 is up here at the height of the relationship, and you have 2014 here, the line goes straight down with various events that bring it down, down, down. Of course, you have resets along the way, but the trend line goes straight down over this 25 to 30-year period. And so you can track that. Laurie mentioned several of the events that go along the way. I actually am writing a book that tracks this by events, that looks at the interaction between Russia, the Europeans, and the Americans for each event, and shows how the relationship spirals downwards with each event. Of course, NATO enlargement, as Sir Laurie says, is one that from the Russian, and I want to stress that in this downward spiral, all sides hold blame. All sides are responsible, just like in any relationship, that especially when it goes badly. It's very difficult to say it's only one side's fault. So if you look at NATO enlargement from the Russian perspective, it seemed relentless, and the most important thing about it is that it appeared to exclude Russia after, as Laurie says, from 89, 91, there was a sense of, hey, Russia's going to be brought into Europe, it's going to be brought into the European security architecture, whereas instead, over time, there was a sense of constant doors being closed. So it's certainly explicable from a Western point of view as to why NATO enlarged. There was a push factor as well as a pull factor from the Baltics and from Central Europe, obviously. They wanted to be part of the West. It's understandable that they wanted to escape the former Soviet subjugation and that legacy. But nevertheless, from the Russian perspective, this felt like and exclusion. And there was resentment, again, the role of emotion over this. Of course, there was, as I think Bucharest Summit of 2008, as Laurie says, is the highlight of this moment of a sense of this enlargement that is not going to stop from 1999 to 2004 and then 2008. That is the moment that the George Bush and company were going to offer a membership action plan for NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. There was a compromise between Condoleezza Rice and Merkel and all that. That was, as Laurie said, that was the worst of all worlds because it said, we won't give NATO membership now, but sometime in the future. And so as Bill Burns, the current CIA director, who was the American ambassador at the time, he had written, this summit happened in April. In February, he wrote a memorandum, which I'm sure you read at the time, that said, there will be war. So that was, if you do this. He predicted, it's now published in his book, so it's common knowledge. Even back in 1997, there was Yevgeny Primakov, who met with the former NATO General Secretary, Javier Solana, who said they were friends. And he said, Javier, look, there is no Russian president that could ever broker or could ever accept Ukraine or Georgia in NATO. It's just not going to happen. It can't happen peacefully. This is going to happen. And then, of course, there were EU trade deals, a sense that Russian interests were not taken fully into consideration with the actual trade deal that was made, offered to Ukraine and various others of the Eastern Partnership, a sense, once again, that Russian interests were being disregarded in its own neighborhood, even in its own backyard. And then, of course, something that Laurie did not mention, which is critically important, I think, here, Iraq of 2003. That invasion was very important for the Russian mindset because it said that regime change by force, when you don't have, when international law is not on your side, is okay. In other words, the rules-based order really is a sham. It's really about great power competition. And this was the Russian interpretation of it. And you mentioned Kosovo, it was the same sort of thing, regime change by force when the NATO bombing of Serbia over Kosovo in 1999, that happened earlier. So there was beginning to be a pattern of exclusion plus America and the West will violate international law as a great power when it behooves them. So all of a sudden this, and you mentioned mindset, this Russian mindset, which is deeply Hobbesian, deeply amongst a lot of the foreign policy community, right, says, well, it's all about great power competition. The rules-based order isn't really, it's a bit of a sham. Ultimately, great powers will do what they do, and the small powers will suffer as they must. And then, as the turning point happens in 04-05 with the Orange Revolution, as you mentioned. But again, the reason why that's so important, it's like Baghdad today, Eurasia tomorrow, because there were a series of colored revolutions during that time, as you all will remember. There was one in Georgia, there was one in Central Asia, and then, of course, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And this sense of, well, if the United States will have regime change by force in Baghdad, what's to prevent it happening in Kiev or eventually Moscow? So this combination of relentless enlargement combined with lack of regard for international law began to make the Russian side feel pretty much as if they were, this was turning into a proxy war between the United States and NATO. And that's why 2004, 2005, I've been told some recent interviews that I've been doing with some Russian elites that are still in Moscow saying for them, that was the turning point that they began to feel that Ukraine was no longer, it was not between Ukraine and Russia, it's between the United States and Russia. 04, 05, based on everything that I've just said, this relentless enlargement by US-led West and also a disregard for international law that might have regime change by force, they began to look at Ukraine as a proxy war between the United States and NATO. And that has been a very interesting finding from some of the research that I found. But this is not to say that the West is only to blame. It is an action-reaction force. There was no attempt on the Russian side to address Baltic, Polish, or Central and East European security dilemmas, security needs, their sense of threat. Instead, just the opposite happened. You had you had energy blackmail being used. You had all kinds of cyber attacks, these kinds of things. There was a sense of, well, we don't even need to talk to the Central and East Europeans, the Balts, because they're small states. Again, this mindset that small states don't matter. You skip over them and you talk only to the United States. So of course their security fears were exacerbated. But then of course, as they joined NATO, Russia's own security fears spiral or get worse. So you have what's called a security dilemma, that each side acts in a way that exacerbates the security fears of the other. And each side is completely blind to how its own actions exacerbate the security fears of the other side. It is called a security dilemma, and it's an action-reaction dynamic that went over 25 years. So I see this more as a series of events, of missteps, of blunders, of misunderstandings, miscalculations of security dilemmas, of mismatched mindsets, a real Hobbesian mindset on the Russian side, much more of a liberal internationalist and even Kantian view on the Western side, and of course the nature of the political systems on all sides. All of this with, again, a blindness to the strategic impact that one side had felt that its actions would have on the other. All of this went down, down, down until February of 2014, when Putin panicked and grabbed Crimea and fomented war in the Donbass. Now, I'll just finish this how did we get here action-reaction downward spiral by saying that there were attempts along the way to change this dynamic on both sides. When I say both, I mean primarily the United States and on the Russian side. There was something in 2009, 2010, during the Obama reset, that said, look, it's called the Euro-Atlantic Security Initiative, or EASY, which turned out to be incredibly hard. And it was funded by an organization that funds a project that I'm working on with Russians called Carnegie Corporation. And there you had some of the finest minds in Russia. Dmitry Trenin, you had all kinds of different people, or a big cluster of people, Vladimir Baranovsky, I won't get into them, but many, many very smart, intellectual experts in Moscow, combined with the same kinds of high-quality people in the West, in the United States, and also in Europe. And they tried to say, look, we're going to have strategic empathy. They used that word a lot. The Americans will understand the Russian perspective, and we are going to try to find ways to meet some of their security needs. The Russians said, you know what? We're going to go to East and Central Europe. We're going to have peace and reconciliation with the Poles. You may remember some of that in 2010 when Putin and the Poles were trying to work some of that out. A lot of that originated during this period. And they did something really that was going to be the pinnacle of this. It was called ballistic missile defense sharing. They were going to share it. That was going to be the ultimate symbol of this kind of new approach to overcome this downward trend. Well, it failed. It failed for a number of reasons. And I think one of in interviewing the people who were involved in this, said all sides felt somehow deceived by the other, but for the Russians, they felt that the Americans were too instrumental. The Americans felt the Russians really weren't trying. They didn't have their real heart in this. But what is really sad was the conclusion, particularly on the Russian side. And it's very, very important, I think, to just end with this. This sense of, well, it's the tragedy of great power competition. It's almost ineluctable. It's almost inevitable that we can't stop this. This kind of Kantian cooperation where each side can find some common ground is not possible in that's, John Mearsheimer has that book, The Tragedy of Great Power, of great powers. And that was one of the conclusions that the Russians had. And from 2010, they just sort of drifted and thought, well, this is kind of ineluctable, and here we are. So I think, I don't believe it was inevitable. I'm not a Hobbesian, but I think that's why it's so important to unpick what happened and how it happened, to see where we all went wrong, and we can come back to that.
Thanks, Julie. We'll come to Q&A in a bit, but we'll get a few more of bits of our structure out there. So where we are now and what happens next. Just a couple of thoughts in there that we might pick up as we go on. So while you were talking, I remember an anecdote with another very senior Russian, again, who I won't name, but we sort of play afterwards of the game of who this might have been. So this would have been about 2009. And I was sitting in a meeting with him in his office, and the conversation was taking some fairly strange turns. And then he came out and said, look, the problem with this conversation is that we're talking as if great powers and lesser powers had the same rights, and we both know that isn't true. And I sort of looked at him, and my visitor from London looked at him, and we said, did we just hear him say that? I mean, there's this thing called the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act, and, which says exactly that countries do have equal rights to security. So the question that follows from me, or more than one question. So first of all, it's the agency and sovereignty of everybody else in this system. So you mentioned earlier on, trade agreements, the emerging agreements between Ukraine and the EU. They were agreements being negotiated by a sovereign elected government. So there's a problem there in a third party coming in and saying, no, you're not. There is, by the way, another problem there, which is that the Russians were telling me at the time, there's been no consultation whatsoever on any of this, which is simply not true. There have been at least 30 Russia-EU consultations by that stage. The other point, which is one that troubles me even more, it is the nature of security in post-Cold War Europe. So a little anecdote here. I was in Romania in the early 1990s. And those of us who were in Central and Eastern Europe at the time remember what it was like. So my question, particularly to my Russian counterparts in Moscow, is looking at the available scenarios in 1990, is Russia less or more secure as a result of the consequences of NATO and EU enlargement? I will sit here and argue that you're more secure, not less secure. Do you want to pick up on any of that?
I think what's so interesting is this question of agency. I think that's probably one of the biggest, the fact that small states don't have agency was one of the biggest shocks for me in living in Moscow amongst when I was associated with Moscow State I teach at Moscow State University, or I did until last February, and also at the Moscow State Institute for International Relations and at Vyshka. And one of the things that struck me the most was just how deeply this view that only great powers really have agency, that small powers do not have agency, and it's almost taken as for granted. And for me, as a Westerner, but also as an American steeped in this idea, even though you could argue that they would say, well, you're another great power too. I said, yes, but we're also, we were colonies that shrugged off being the empire. And so we do have a little bit of a underdog spirit where you protect the small power because we were once the small power. So that was almost with mother's milk. But it's in the UN Charter, as you say. It's in Helsinki, 1975. I mean, the idea that small powers have agency. But that was one of the things, and I think it goes very, very deep in to explain part of where we are, this mindset a little bit. And also, too, I agree with you about the Eastern Partnership trade deals. I'm not saying that for 1 second that the Russian perspective is 100% accurate, but I do think there is something to the fact that in my work with some of the European Union people, they did say that once the Russians weren't that interested in participating and like, this is not for us, then they didn't communicate all that well, and there wasn't enough of attempt. I think both sides probably could have done a better job at predicting what could happen from this, and to made sure they participated in it. But I'm not saying for 1 second that it's all the EU's fault. But what I'm talking about is questions of perceptions here.
Thank you. So I was there in Moscow at the time, and of course the focus at the time was on the EU's 4 common spaces, the EU-Russia 4 common spaces, and the question of WTO, World Trade Organization accession. And my take on that at the time is that I don't even have to think about this. This is the closest thing to a no-brainer on my desk. I mean, how would we not wish Russia to be in the global rules-based trading system? Should we move on and talk a bit about where are we now? Do you want to attempt to explain where we are now?
Well, I mean, one of the questions that we were asking is why did Russia do so badly in this special military operation, right? I mean, and I think that is until this fall. And it's interesting because from December, Putin has started to use the word war. But up until that time, obviously, special military operation. So I think there are 2 different things here. So when we were talking about this before, why has Russia been doing so badly? I'm going to just look, just 2 elements of this. This is such a long conversation, but I'm just going to add 2 small elements to this and then give it over to you. I think, why did Russia do so badly? Why has it been such a shocking thing that they which has been a surprise to absolutely everyone? Not only was the assault on Ukraine a shock to everybody, as we were discussing before this, but also because I was here the day after, or the 2 days afterwards, with you, and we were all shocked that it happened. But even more so now, then how is it that they did so badly? Nobody anticipated. I remember that. It's like, well, with Laurie Friedman saying they'll probably do quite well because, Russian military is Russian military. What a shock. Well, why? Well, and I think part of it has systemic weakness. With Russia's personalistic authoritarian regime, they've got a power vertical problem here, that there's no accountability except for the man of Putin really himself. The only real institution in Russia is, of course, the executive, or really rather Vladimir Putin, and that of course reduces the accurate flow of information. We've all heard that, but in the military it's quite interesting, where you have a flawed military feedback loop as a result of this, where Putin has a plan of what he wants to do and what he wants the military to achieve. Putin then relies on the military to tell him what should be done based on his plan, but then of course the military has to tailor what should be done based on what his vision is. So it's a very faulty feedback loop all around what Putin originally wants, because no one's really going to tell him what the reality is, because there's no checks and balances really to stop it. It's really based on what Mr. Putin thinks has to happen. Now, of course, the other problem is that this power vertical is very difficult to maintain, and particularly in this war, you've had a lot of factionalism, as we've seen within the military, a very vociferous situation with a lot of independent military forces, for example, the Wagner Group, and so forth, and Kadyrov, of course, and Putin recently trying to reinstitute this power vertical in the military by reappointing Gerasimov as head of the military, saying, no, you're going to be above Surovikin, and we're going to reimpose this kind of discipline, this kind of power vertical, so that all of these parts will work holistically, and you won't have such a vociferousness going on. But that doesn't solve the inherent weakness. I'm not convinced that it's going to solve the problem. There are a lot of experts here on the Russian military who would be able to speak to this as well. But there are the original weakness in this kind of system, where you have this bad feedback loop around this personalistic regime, is still going to be there, and I don't know how to solve it. The second problem is a mindset problem. Once again, and again, I'm an analyst. I'm very interested in mindset, but because of this very structural, realist sense. There was a sense that the war would be structurally predetermined. By that I mean, look, I was there in Moscow just shortly before, it was in December, before all this was happening, and it was explained to me, okay, the United States is in relative decline relative to China, which is of course on the rise. The United States this is the perfect moment because you're going to continue to go downhill. Look what's happening to your domestic cohesion. It's an absolute mess. You're going to be increasingly weak relative to China. So you're going to have to cede American hegemony to China, and that means that you're going to ultimately have to allow greater equality on the international stage, which basically means letting each of us have our sphere of influence, going back to great power competition, so we each have our sphere of influence. You can't have this kind of order the way you see it, what you call your rules-based order, and it's going to happen whether you like it or not because of China. So it's inevitable what's going to happen anyway, and so that created a kind of optimism that time really was on Russia's side, thanks to China. Very, very important point that added an element of really false optimism or unjustified optimism on the Russian side. In addition to that, there was too much focus on, as they tend to do, too much focus on material factors in thinking about all this, on militaries, and lack of thinking about national identity. Ukrainian national identity, it doesn't matter. Ukrainian will, forget it. It's about material factors. The Russian army is stronger. The Russian military, the Russian economy is stronger. This is just a little power. There's no way they could win against us. That kind of thing. The role of domestic politics don't matter as much in this mentality. The role of emotions don't really matter if you're a structural realist. So that Ukrainian will to persevere no matter what has been a real shock, because they didn't even think about how the Ukrainians would react. So I will give you, those are just two things, structure, mindset plus some of the problems of the system.
Thank you. You gave me time to reassemble my notes as well. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, so a couple of things I really just wanted to pick out of that. A few things that have been vexing, troubling me actually over the last year or so. I mean, first of all, let's come back to the basics. How did Russia get it so badly wrong? And I think, I've now boiled it down to about three things that the Kremlin fundamentally misunderstood. They fundamentally misunderstood themselves, they fundamentally misunderstood Ukraine, and they misunderstood us. And I'm starting to wonder whether they misunderstood China too. But we might come on to that. Obviously I need to unpack that a little bit, to say the least. But it's a catalogue of first-order strategic disasters, one after the other. And the question that raises for me is how do you achieve that? How do you get there? And one of the things, two things in there that I really just want to hone in on, and we might pick up in the Q&A. First of all, it's something I've been discussing a lot and thinking about a lot in the last couple of years. It's self-reinforcing beliefs. Cognitive bias is confirmation bias. I was in Afghanistan during the end of the 20-year operation in Afghanistan. We did not want to believe what we were seeing, but it was happening. And this is a real problem for policymakers, and I think it's a problem for analysts as well. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean it isn't happening. And I think there's a real issue there in how you build expertise, including the expertise to actually ask the right questions and then listen to the answers. And I think this is something that's very, very important for academics and think tanks to think about how you add value to the policy-making thing. The other, I refuse to use the word special military operation. We should call it what it is. It's a war of aggression. And there is another word that we should not shy away from. It's lying. This is a system that systematically lies to itself, to us, to its population. If we don't understand that, we don't understand how it works. And I think, again, in trying to get inside the mentality of how it makes its decisions, how those decisions can go so badly wrong, we've got to think about that. What happens to when you willfully distort the truth? And I think that's becoming a quite serious issue now in domestic Russian politics. There was one other thing I just wanted to mention. Yeah, perhaps we should move on to the what happens next question now, and use that as the pivot into it. Because I know, Julie, you wanted to talk a bit about what's actually happening inside Russian society. I mean, it does seem to me, I mean, it's getting harder and harder, and I've heard this from Russian journalists in exile as well, harder and harder to really get inside the skin of what is happening in that country. I can't travel there. I know an increasing number of people who cannot travel. Even if we could, I think I'd find it increasingly hard even to compute what is happening. And of course, it's now next to impossible to have the sorts of frank conversations that you need really to do what we were describing earlier, which is, again, I've stopped using the word strategic empathy because it's so easy to misunderstand or misrepresent. But just to understand what is going on in the mentality of an opponent, if you're looking at it from the perspective of a policymaker.
So, do you want to go into...
Should we move on to
Yes.
what we think happens next?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Okay, right.
I mean, I'm happy to start. But one thing you didn't talk about is you said maybe we should talk a little bit about the situation inside Russia first.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe sort of use one to pivot into the other. So I'll just put a few comments out there, and then perhaps for you to pick up. So first of all, the battlefield itself. I think all of us who get asked to comment to the media, almost invariably find yourself saying, do not extrapolate from what happened yesterday to what will happen 6 months from now. I do not think we're anywhere near the end of this war. I mean, I wish we were, but I cannot see a path from here to an early end to this war without one side or the other collapsing. And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I mean, if anybody has any better information there, I'm all ears. But I also don't see a path from here to a negotiated outcome for a very simple reason, that there is nothing to negotiate. You've got one side that wishes to essentially destroy the other side, and a side that does not wish to be destroyed. I mean, I don't know what the ground is for negotiation. But perhaps to move it on to Russia's internal politics, I don't see that changing until fundamental change comes to Russia. And that will not happen for as long as Mr. Putin is in power or people like him are in power. So I think the conclusion I draw from that is that we now have a generational problem on our hands with all sorts of dimensions. So a few that I want to pick up are, first of all, how does this work in terms of Russia itself? So one of the things that I was focusing on last year is, what does it mean to have formative experiences? So I touched right at the beginning on some of the formative experience of those late Soviet KGB men who are now running the place. It creates a certain mentality, a view of the world. What do we think is happening in the minds of Russians who were now born in the time of Mr. Putin and are now coming up, are now in voting age? What will their formative experiences be? I don't know, but I think we would be a bit naive and foolish if we thought that what comes out of the other side of this is a completely simple acknowledgement that Russia was wrong, the West was right, democracy is great, and so on. I mean, again, I would love it to be true, but I kind of doubt it, actually. The other set of problems I think that we in the West need to focus on is that, if I'm right, I think I am, this conflict will go on through our own political cycles. And certain things follow from that. So there are 3 or 4 really important political and electoral cycles coming up. Russian, US, Turkish, and Ukrainian. And in each of those, you've got forces operating within society that are not necessarily driven by this conflict in the case of the external players, but which the conflict impacts on. So I think it's for the analytical community as well to keep in the public mind actually what is at stake here, as a number of countries, including prospectively the UK in the next couple of years, go through political cycles where this conflict it's foremost in some people's mind, but for most people outside Russia or Ukraine, it's probably going to be other things.
No, I think that's very interesting. a very good point, the fact that you've got these elections coming up and the role of that domestic politics are going to play. One of the things, so I'm just going to pick up on that and then come to scenarios for the future. One of the things that really interests me looking at Russia right now, Russian society, there is a sense that there is a genuine support for this war. I think that Levada and those kinds of poll days have been very criticized for the way they have been conducting a lot of polls. It's very difficult to do polls, particularly even at the best of times, but in this environment, it's very difficult to trust the poll data. So with that caveat, but nevertheless, there is a sense that there is a real support, both among the society and among the elites. And when I say elites, I'm not talking necessarily about obviously there's support around the elites around Putin, but I'm even talking about the larger foreign policy making community. There are factions within it. There's disagreement. It's not monolithic. Russia's never monolithic, obviously, but the majority does seem to support it. And you have some really interesting sociological work by Marlène Laruelle, who is a very good academic in the United States, even though she's French, as you can tell by her name. But she does a lot of work on Russian national conservative ideology, and 73% of the Russian people they adhere to what's called national conservative views, attitudes, policy preferences, and those tend to embrace patriotism, conservative social agendas, religion, a lot of military education, those kinds of things. So 73% and they've done some really great studies. This is going on even before, very consistent work that's been going on since before the war, but it certainly is continuing now. And I think this ideological outlook helps to explain the second aspect of why Russian elites and Russian society tends to support this war for now, for now. And that is that there's something called, which I think is a really interesting term, defensive consolidation around the war. And what is this? I mean, I was so struck by the paintings here because I think it's really perfect, where this defensive consolidation, it's a psychological response. This is a guy named Jeremy Morris who's coined this term. He's British, and he's a sociologist. He's coined this term. It's about a psychological response to Russia's loss of its collective purpose after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this defensive sense of defensive consolidation is a form of patriotism that is imbued with nostalgia, a really kind of what you call toxic nostalgia, and desperation. Those are the two ways that they just sort of a nostalgia and a sense of desperation. And so this keyword desperation, I think, is very critical because it suggests that it's something quite negative, this defensive consolidation. And that it helps to explain why the Russian foreign policy elites, so I've been doing a bunch of interviews, telephone interviews, with some of the ones who are still in Moscow saying, explain to me some of your thinking. Okay, granted, they're not going to tell me in this environment what they really think. But, I've been around with the Soviet Union. You get used to reading between the lines or listening between the lines. And there's a sense of sincerity, I think, among some of them, that they really believe this is an existential crisis for them, an existential war for them, and therefore defensive consolidation for them is where they are. Why is it existential for Russians, you say? You might ask, okay, for Ukraine, obviously it's existential for them, but why for Russia? Well, it was explained to me, and I think I really do, after so many decades of studying Russia, it really makes sense. It is that Russia, being a country that has felt threats both from internal collapse and external pressure, and has always withstood those threats by becoming a great power. Державность, or great power, is about a national security strategy to counter those threats, internal and external. And if you remove the one pillar of internal cohesion, which is the leader, and if he wobbles as a result of losing this war, and you remove that institution, the fear is that Russia will descend into internal chaos or chaos, and you'll have these smutne vremena, this time of troubles with 15,000 nuclear weapons up for grabs. And they said, we would rather fight this war to the end, even if it destroys us all, rather than have this happen, that Russia will be lost forever. So there is a sense of, we will fight to the end. Obviously, you have Ukraine that's going to fight to the end. And the scenario there is, well, as you said, it's hard to imagine any kind of negotiated concession or compromise or any kind of territorial concessions on Ukraine's part because, well, Ukraine, it's hard to imagine them giving up their land after having fought so hard and courageously. But also, it's hard to see how this maximalist Russia that is now, it's existential for them, is going to give up and back down either. So then where does that leave us? Because many people are saying, oh, we need a negotiated compromise. I don't see it either, Laurie, that they're going to do. So then people are saying, well, maybe there'll be some kind of Korean-style division of just, that is a possibility, of ceasefire kind of line of cessation of hostilities. Well, that's something, but I don't see, or perhaps maybe like a Pakistan-type Kashmir, India, Pakistan, just again, as kind of a ceasefire type thing. I'm not sure I see that either, because if you go to, as Olga Alakar, who's the head of the crisis group for Russia, she pointed out recently, don't forget what Putin started this war with, and that is he wanted regime change in Kiev. So it's not about territory for him. It is about, as was pointed out to me in some of my interviews, having a friendly Kiev, having a friendly Ukraine. So this won't stop just with territory. So even if you have a cessation, even if you have a negotiated kind of compromise, I don't see this stopping until, as you rightly say, something changes in Moscow, which brings us back to the internal sector. I think Tatiana Stanovaya, who is somebody who does some really interesting work on Russian domestic politics, says, too, 2024, these elections, and I'll end where you brought up the domestic elections, Russian presidential elections, this will be very, very, very important year, because with the economy getting worse, you know, the oil price now for Urals oil is around $44, maybe $50, where they're balancing their budget at $70. So they're 70% down on profits on oil and gas month on month. That was the economy is they're going into recession. The economy is not doing so well. So as this happens, and as if they go in for a second mobilization and more body bags come back, et cetera, then, you know, who knows what's going to happen inside Moscow. It's something very, very important to watch. And as you said, I think very rightly, we have to get rid of our cognitive biases where we only see what we want to see and see Russia as it is, and try and understand it, what's happening from their perspective.
Thank you. We should probably open to a Q&A now, or any comments that anyone wants to put on that. I'll just, first of all, though, just finish off this section with a comment on that. So I should preface this by saying that I'm not saying that we are responsible for Putin's war of aggression. We should be very clear, we are not. He is responsible for it. Those are choices made in the Kremlin by the people in the Kremlin. But I keep coming back to a conversation I had with a colleague in Cambridge 11 months ago, so a month after the war started. And we were both lamenting, well, that kind of there goes our life's work, really. I mean, you know, everything that we've been trying to do for the last 30 years. This was actually, I won't name her, but she's a colleague of yours, and her job is teaching the region. And after a few seconds of this lamentation, I said, look, tell me this: do we now need fewer or more people who understand Russia and the region? I think actually the answer is probably more, but also the policymakers need to listen to them. So my point really is that it's about the absolute imperative in this very dangerous situation of reading your opponents and intentions and motivations correctly. And the converse of that, which is understanding how your own actions and messages are landing by those people. So just to sort of really rub the point in, one of the things you learn very, very quickly, particularly now, is how hard it is to read intentions and motivations in the Kremlin. We're back in the world of Kremlinology, so people studying the guys over the river, in our case. What on earth are they up to? And you're kind of looking at Pravda and Izvestia and sort of, okay, so who's standing next to the coffin when the guy dies? And trying to work backwards from that. But there is a mirror image of that, and I've come across this again and again and again. I've spoken to senior Russian officials who should know better, but they have no clue how we work, none whatsoever, and actually very, very dangerous misapprehensions about that. Right,
That's going to get worse.
It's going to get worse. So I suggest we take a question each in a more or less random way, and see where we go from there. There was someone put his hand up right at the back, about 10 minutes in. Do you want to go first?
Thank you very much. A lot to discuss there, but so, if we focus on personalities, arguably in one way, we are dealing with, when it comes to Putin, Putin has probably the same number of friends as a man on a desert island, and yet he has an entitlement to a whole nation. If we had anybody like that in regular society, we'd probably send them to mental asylum. And maybe it is a step too far to say that we are effectively dealing with a lunatic, but arguably we are. I think some people would say with that. So, in some extent, should our policy to Russia be therefore as stable in our outlook as possible, and just therefore maintain some kind of stability until a future comes?
Yeah. So, I got out of the business on commenting on foreign leaders' states of mental or physical health a long time ago. I don't think it's helpful, actually. I think the biggest problem, though, with the proposition that you just maintain stability until something else comes along is what we have got is so far from stability that option is simply not available. And to illustrate that from a much earlier stage in the degeneration of Russia's relations with the West. So one of the things I had to deal with when I was ambassador in Moscow, it must have been 2018, 2019, the collapse of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So again, there are various versions as to what happened and why and in what order about that. But the fact of the matter is that basically, for their own reasons, the Russians brought the treaty down. They developed a missile that was in contravention of it, built it and deployed it. And we were saying to them, don't do this. And the treaty collapsed as a result. My anecdote, though, is I was trying to explain to my staff in the embassy why this mattered. And it was that thing where you're getting blank stares back. And then all of a sudden I realized why. It's because none of my staff were old enough to remember the Euromissiles crisis in the 80s. I am. And the point here is it was not only a very dangerous situation in the sense that you've got missiles with flight times measured in minutes, which means you've got decision times measured in minutes about whether or not you're going to nuclear war. But also the reaction in the West of deploying the cruise and Pershing missiles put very, very serious strain on the NATO alliance as well. So it's a really big deal. If what you're telling yourself is that if we just don't react, we wind it in, we don't give them the Leopards or the Challengers or whatever, and somehow things will be more stable, they will not. This is an inherently unstable situation, and we need to understand and manage the risks around it.
No, I think.
Hello, yeah. So it was very interesting, thank you. I normally am very sympathetic to the idea that there is no monocausal explanation to things and situations. And I was interested how you described it. At the same time, I think I was slightly surprised that you described everything in ideological terms, as though the Kremlin and Putin are ideologues. So they are motivated by big ideas rather than certain self-interest. And I think that's slightly ignoring the elephant in the room, because in situations, in governments where government change doesn't happen in a peaceful way, what we see today is almost slightly inevitable, because if you cannot change presidents in a peaceful manner, the president will have to hold on to power one way or another, and often that does lead to external enemies and wars. And it feels very convincing to me, and I think that's often is how many Russians in the opposition see the situation, that it is a war that is motivated by a government needing to hold on to power. And I think if one sees it like that, then also the implications of how it could change differ from if it was really an ideological dilemma that we face today. So one thing, if Russian leaders are such ideologues who are very caring about Russia's future, Russia's security, Russia's interest. Another thing, if they're interested in keeping the power to themselves in terms of what the future holds. You see what I mean?
No, I understand. I'll start on that. It's a good point. I think you said you're sympathetic to staying away from monocausal explanations, and yet I think in some ways you've offered one, which is the nature of the regime. Yes, yeah, right. I think I certainly would never suggest that it's the Russian mindset, you called it ideology, but the Russian mindset that is the cause. I also would accept exactly and agree absolutely that the nature of the regime, this personalistic authoritarian regime, is a large part of the explanation. You cannot not count that, as you rightly say. And you mentioned interest, vested interest as well. And I thought you were going to go down that route of economic interest, personal interest. All that matters too. But yeah, but it all interacts, and that's what's tricky. That's what's very difficult to tease out and to weight the different factors that come into play. But you also can't ignore mindset, the way people analyze the world and ascribe the intentions of the other side will have impacted not just because of the system in which they operate, but also the culture in which the mental outlook, the framework for analysis that they have. And also they're human beings in the sense that they get very buffeted by their own emotions, which build up, particularly in someone like Vladimir Putin. You were saying before that he seemed awfully, the gentleman in the back said, he seemed almost irrational, certainly emotional, certainly that you really saw a lot of emotion coming out. And a sense of resentment, revenge, that kind of thing. So I think all of these things matter. Is my response to you. The tricky bit is to show how they interact, and that's that kind of work is very, very difficult to do. But you're right. I mean, the system, the nature of the system, helps explain some of this, but it's not the whole story. It certainly is not the whole story either. That's a mistake to think that it's inadequate to explain it all through that either.
So some years ago, there tended to be a sort of rule of thumb, at least amongst some policymakers, that Russia, the modern Russian state was a kind of ideology-free zone, certainly by comparison with the Soviet Union. My view on this has changed over time. I think actually there is now, you call it an ideology, a set of organizing principles, but they are very powerful and they are assiduously cultivated. The idea that Russia is a unique civilization, that the Russian Orthodox Church is central to that, that we'll gloss over the ethnic diversity of that nation, but it's there in some of the things Putin was saying about Ukraine. And I think again, if we tell ourselves that this somehow doesn't matter or it isn't so, we're missing it. We're missing something really important. It is being used as a mobilizing factor. You can argue whether it's a cynical thing. Personally, I don't think it is anymore.
It's real.
Yeah. Should we take another one?
Yeah. You had a question.
Can I ask a question, Julie? And so you mentioned that you used to teach at MGU, Moscow State University, and also at Vyshka. And I wonder what's happening sort of with ordinary Russians, with your students, and what's happening with any exchange, if there is any at all.
It's very sad. I have a lot of we run a program for international exchange education that brings together American graduate students from Harvard and Columbia, European graduate students from Oxford and Sciences Po and various other European institutions, and now Ukrainians are involved in that as well, and Russians. Vyshka or HSC and MGIMO used to be our two universities. They're no longer part of it. But we still have a lot of Russians who are part of our program and who attend our training programs. We do them in Athens, Greece now. And we try and get a lot of the emigres, the Russian emigres or exiles, a lot of the first wave of Russians who came out, a lot of Russians who've been studying at Oxford or you know, they would be here, for example, but they still have families at home. Up until December, they joined us. They didn't really want to be. They were very uncomfortable because we would have sometimes foreign agents, not deliberately, but, you know, you're probably foreign agent, you know, if you work for the BBC. So it's that kind of thing. I mean, you know, not to point at you, but I'm just saying, you know, you don't even, you know what I'm saying. You don't even have to be. And the problem is that the student then would feel unsafe to go back home. What would happen with their families back home? After December, it got much, much worse, because in December, Medvedev put out, started this movement to say that if you, as an emigre, say anything negative, really strongly critical of the regime or the war, then you could have your passport canceled forever. And then not only, you know, your property taken, but it's the not being able to go back. And so we've had a whole spate of cancellations of these Russian, these wonderful Russian young people who say that, you know, we want to come, we want to be part of this, because it's all about strategic empathy, trying to understand the other. We don't call it that anymore. It's really comprehension, because strategic empathy is too much of a loaded term these days. But it really is fabulous to see these young people. We bring Ukrainians together, we bring Russians, we have mediators, professional mediators, and have that. Well, the Russians are too frightened to come.
Can I just add a thought to that? It will come across as provocative, and in some ways it is. So one of the things I've been trying to think through over the last 6 months or so in particular is what is the range of day after issues, and what should we be thinking about now, even if there aren't things that we can be doing now? So there will come a time when this war ends, on whatever terms, whatever timing that is. I don't know the answer to either of those. We do know the size and shape of the questions that will need to be addressed. So obviously reconstruction in Ukraine. I mean, it's a country that's been systematically destroyed, is being systematically destroyed as we speak, literally as we speak. There will come questions of transitional justice. There are war crimes being committed as we speak, as a matter of state policy, not accident. I mean, this is what's happening, and there will need to be an accounting for that. There will need to be accounting for the crime of aggression, the biggest crime in international law. It's obvious, it's evident that that's what's happened, and that fact will not go away. The one, though, that I'm particularly interested in, so somebody made this point very powerfully at an event I was doing in Cambridge a few weeks ago. Ukrainians and Russians will still be neighbours. You know, what will happen? What are the options available to them as a result of that? They will have their views on that. It feels a bit indecent, actually, as a foreigner even to be talking about this. But there is a set of questions for me about how we do our thinking now, not only about how we help Ukrainians reconstruct Ukraine when the time comes, but how we help Russians reconstruct Russia. I don't mean physically, I mean the utter destruction of the university system, the intellectual life of that country, disciplines like history, political science, sociology, which have been destroyed as a matter of state policy. Now, that may not matter to Russians, I don't know, that's their business, but it certainly should matter to us. And I don't know what the answer to that is yet.
So, yeah, should Ukraine become a member of NATO?
I'll take that first. I think at this point, I was always against the idea because I thought it was so provocative and wouldn't actually help. At this point, I think Ukrainian security we're so past the point of no return. Ukrainian security is absolutely critical that it be guaranteed. If it's not NATO, I think the Secretary of State Blinken has mooted another idea and recently, and that is, and I think it's probably not a bad thing. It's a way of not being too provocative to the Russians, but guaranteeing Ukrainian security. It's kind of de facto NATO membership without actual NATO membership. It's building up the Ukrainian army. It's making sure that basically continuing to do what the United States and the West have done to guarantee that the Ukrainians have an army that could make sure that they could defend against against any kind of Russian aggression. I was really struck by Henry Kissinger recently at Davos. I don't know if anybody saw this, but he, for the first time, said, I think it was the first time since that Spectator article that got him in so much trouble in June, he said that he thinks now, he thinks that it should become part of NATO. I still think that it's problematic. I mean, if anything, even the Finns and the Swedes are having trouble getting in, let alone with. But I'm not so sure that I was against it as much as I would have been. And I think Secretary Blinken's idea of whatever we do, making sure that there are really potent security guarantees that are everything but NATO in name.
So I have to say, I'm not long out of government, but these are purely personal views. Please don't misinterpret them any other way. So I would take the question, actually I agree with what Julie said, I'd take the question and reframe it a slightly different way. An awful lot depends on how the war ends. So in any scenario short of essentially military defeat for Ukraine, I think certain things follow from that. One is that any stable security system in Europe is focused on essentially security against Russia rather than security with Russia. And what I mean by that is preventing this ever happening again. So if you think back to the Minsk agreements, I mean, the Minsk agreements essentially hardwired in a situation where they were almost an antithesis of a security agreement. And what we've got follows from that. I think the analogy with Sweden and Finland is interesting. So complete change around in the security posture of both of those countries. But the fact of the matter is that you've got two very, very capable military players. And in a way, interests drive institutional relationships rather than the other way around. Whatever happens over particularly Sweden's membership of NATO, with the Turkish question around it, the fact is that we will continue to work ever closer with the Swedes and the Finns because it's overwhelmingly in our interests to do so and in their interests to do so. The other point about this, assuming that Ukraine survives this war, I think they will, I hope they will, what you've got is a country that has essentially fought off Russia. I mean, that is a geopolitical fact and a military fact. And the conclusion I draw from that is that a Ukraine that is in that position is a very, very powerful ally and bulwark for European security, which means our security. And again, the institutional relationships follow from that, not the other way around. It's a purely personal view. Should we take one over here? We need the mic.
Thank you. Given the things that Laurie's just said, what I don't understand is why are we only giving Ukraine the military weapons that they require in sort of piecemeal sort of chunks? Because militarily, I'm assuming, given the way the war has gone so far, that we could win this war, or Ukraine could win this war if we gave them the right tools. And it seems to me 12 Leopard tanks here, 12 Challenger tanks there, a few Abrahams is just prolonging the process and potentially prolonging the stalemate. So why aren't we being a little bit more aggressive? Because if the Russians only really listen to leverage because of their structural reality in the way that why aren't we being a little bit more aggressive in using more military leverage?
So again, I'll offer a few purely personal views on that. Please do not take these as anyone's government policy. And I'm pretty sure that Andrew Monaghan sitting over there has a book sort of forming up on exactly these questions. So just some very, very quick takes on some of the factors involved here. one of the things that we've been trying to do, the West has been trying to do from the very outset, is alliance management. One thing we haven't really talked about enough this evening is the complete and extraordinary turnaround in Germany's Russia policy. I mean, I think the Zeitenwende is real, but it's very, very hard and problematic, both in terms of defense policy and economic policy. It seems to me, at least, to be absolutely axiomatic for the UK that if we don't have a serious and unified alliance Russia policy, we, the UK, have got no Russia policy. So there's a serious thing here about keeping the alliance aligned, pointed in the right direction, clear on what it's trying to achieve. Second, there's a problem here about escalation management. So what nobody wants to do here is to get into a direct Russia-NATO war. Actually, I don't think Russia wants to either. I don't think they have from the outset, because their military planners are no less capable of understanding than ours, just really how dangerous that is, and once you're on that trajectory, how hard it is to get off it. So there's a genuine problem there, and I think we've been testing the boundaries of that really from day one, from the 24th of February last year, actually before as well, with the debates over anti-tank weapons, where we were tying ourselves in knots. Could we provide essentially weapons to counter Russian tanks that shouldn't have been there in the first place? Since we're now on HIMARS, we're on main battle tanks, who knows what, and all the rest of it. The third question, which I really cannot answer at present, I don't know anyone who can, it's what does, I think, did you use the word victory, you use something like that. What does it mean? There is a very, very large set of questions not far out there for all concerned about, before you're talking about when this war ends, what does ending the war actually mean? My own provisional take on that is that the war ends when Russia, for whatever reason, concludes that the costs of continuing outweigh any conceivable benefits and essentially stops. But I don't know what that looks like yet.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think the escalation was what I was going to stress, the real fears of escalation on the part of the West in particular, and certainly the Germans, the French, the Americans. I think all the NATO allies have been very, very worried about it spilling over into a genuine proxy war. It's Russia's perception that it has been a proxy war, as I said, since almost 2004 or 5. But to make it a direct war between NATO and Russia has been the real fear. And the problem is, the red lines were not really clear. Putin has set these red lines, but then we bombed the Kerch Bridge was bombed or hit, and that seemed to then go. There have been things lobbed into Crimea, and those have been overlooked, really. But I think the real fear was, if you give Ukraine offensively capable weapons, like the tanks, even the Bradley fighting vehicles, those kinds of things, then really Ukraine may have the capacity to have an offensive that would put Crimea in play. And the real fear is that if Crimea then becomes in play, that they do know that is Putin's red line, and that he may panic and reach for a tactical nuclear weapon. That is one thing that has been stressed as something that would be a red line for Putin if Crimea were somehow taken back. And I'm interested in the Americans saying recently, I was reading Blinken, he's been talking a lot these past couple of weeks as they've been making this decision whether to give the Abrams tanks or not, and pushing the Germans to give the Leopards, to free the Leopards. And one of the things that he said was, look, we're not interested in giving the Ukrainians the capacity to actually take back Crimea. It's to show them that Crimea can be in play to make the Russians realize that the cost of continuing outweigh the benefits of what this all-out maximalist war, that whatever their victory would look like, it seems to be almost to topple Zelensky if you look at it. If you take Russia at its word. But so the fear that the more, if you give Ukraine those offensive weapons, that then somehow they might be able to take back Crimea, I think, or even get close to taking it back, and that really would escalate beyond, it really could escalate, I think is something that really would. But as soon as Blinken said, and I think the American administration said, no, this is really about generating leverage, and we'll make that clear. This is not about necessarily, maybe we'll park Crimea, they don't say it publicly, but maybe Crimea will just be parked or something. Maybe it won't be taken back, but nevertheless, that's really the fear, is that once Crimea is in play, it'll really escalate.
Just one thing to that, which I think we do need to remember and remind ourselves from time to time, that Crimea is within the internationally recognized boundaries of Russia, including recognized in treaties by Russia, including a treaty signed by one Vladimir Putin. So the problem doesn't go away.
You mean in Ukraine, not in Russia?
Sorry,
yeah.
Sorry, may I just re-speak on that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's exactly. So it's within Ukraine's internationally recognized boundaries. Yeah.
Right.
We have a question from an online audience. So Hava Rivas asks, to which degree the war in Ukraine is a civil war? Are there similarities between the consequences of fail of Yugoslavia and USSR?
Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I understood
Yeah,
it.
sorry. To which degree is the war in Ukraine is a civil war? Are there similarities between the consequences of fall of Yugoslavia and USSR?
I'll just comment on the Civil War part very, very quickly. It's a question that comes up a lot, particularly among my Russian students, because that's where it's promoted that it was a civil war, and therefore it's hey, the Russians are not really a party in the war, it's just a civil war. That, I think, is really unfounded by the evidence. There's been a lot of work done on the Donbass region from 2014 to 2022. Beforehand, there's a lot by an organization in Berlin called Zeus. And they have found, just two poll data items that I think answer the question. 2016, 2019, they found that the citizens of the whole oblasts, the whole regions of the Donbass, of Luhansk and Donetsk, 65% of them wanted to stay part of Ukraine without any autonomous separation whatsoever. And in the Donetsk People's Republic and in the Luhansk People's Republic, that number is 55%. This was in 2016 as well as in 2019. The numbers shift slightly in between them, but that's basically the two numbers, 65%, 55%. That is not a civil war type situation. Those people wanted to stay part of Ukraine. It's not that they wanted to defect from Ukraine. And my point is, I think some of that work shows that Russia then took advantage of some of the, yes, there were problems, there were protests and those kinds of things, but that Russia fomented and took advantage of the situation to pump it up and make it into what became a war, but not a civil war. And on the Yugoslav part, I'll pass.
Yeah, look, I'm going to speak very frankly on this. I think the idea that this is a civil war at heart is total nonsense. There are different sorts of war. I think a much better way of thinking about what's happening here is a combination of a war of secession, a war of succession, and a war of independence. So secession in the sense of, the roots of this lie in the roots of the breakup of the Soviet Union. So that meeting in the forest, where the three leaders decided between them that they were going to dissolve the Soviet Union, and they went back and told the poor guy in Moscow that what he didn't know. That's the unfinished business, I think, of that secession, the mutual secession from the Soviet Union. War of independence, it's pretty clear what is going on here. This is an invasion of one sovereign country by another. That's the fact of the matter, and by the way, of a sovereign country recognized as a sovereign country in successive treaties by the other. So I don't really see how you escape from that. What I'm increasingly thinking of, though, now is of this as a war of succession in Russia. So I think a lot of the roots of this conflict lie to a greater or lesser degree in the dawning realization that there is a transfer of power coming in Russia, and there is unfinished business that the people at the top, particularly the man at the top, wishes to address in that time. And you know, the more I see the thing go on and the more I see the developments in Russia, I think actually that's probably the correct way of thinking about it now.
You mentioned that Russia may have misread China, and I wonder whether China has a role to play in this conflict. What is China's position, and could China even contribute to a peace settlement?
So, yeah, China is, I think, a fascinating case in all of this. The elements I think I would want to bring out, I don't know actually whether China has a role to play or not, you know, because for the simple fact that we're not in a settlement scenario yet. You know, we may be, we may not be, I don't know. And at that stage, the question of, you know, who's best placed to be a mediator, you know, will come into play. For me, the salient facts here are, first of all, I think, you know, Putin's misreading probably, you know, I struggle a bit with the evidence here, but misreading probably of how much he thought that Xi Jinping would have his back. I personally, I think there was a serious misreading here. So what are the most important things in Xi Jinping's world? It was managing the succession through the 20th Party Congress, or actually managing the non-succession through the 20th Party Congress, you know, the unheard of, you know, third term. It's managing China's now very, very serious domestic economic and other tensions. I mean, you know, they've got serious internal issues that they need to address around the economy, the demography, the governance system, and of course Taiwan, and not having those strategic calculations complicated by Mr. Putin's adventures in Ukraine. And the way I read the very, very stark, clear warnings not to even contemplate use of nuclear weapons out of Beijing in public, essentially, it's exactly that. You know, we are the Chinese Communist Party. We are in the interests of China. If you wish to do whatever you want to do in Ukraine, don't do it in a way that impacts on our interests. That's how I read that message.
I'm glad you mentioned the China thing because it's something that we wanted to get to, but we didn't, because it's really is the elephant in the room, I think, in many ways. It's a critical player in here. Whether it be a mediator is a different question, but certainly Putin, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he may not have made this gamble if he didn't think he had China in his back pocket. This is really clear. And thinking, because if you think about it, as some Russian pointed out to me not very long ago, the Soviet Union didn't have as many friends in the late 1970s as Putin has in the global south, with China and there's to a large degree India and Pakistan and Israel, and then a lot in Latin America, Latin Africa. He's actually got quite a number of quasi-friends. A lot of them are neutral, they abstained, but you know, they play sides off of each other, but they certainly haven't criticized Russia the way the Soviet Union had very few allies the way Putin feels that he may have now. So that's really interesting that he felt like he had China, you know, friendship without limits, a relationship without limits. That said, he's been disappointed, I think, by China's reaction, because China hasn't helped to the same degree that he was hoping that they would. They haven't criticized overtly, but they also haven't helped with the military aid. There's some evidence that they were expecting more military aid. There's apparently a little bit going on. I think the CIA is very worried about what's, you know, is there, but it's still very careful not to go against the sanctions. The Chinese are very careful. Why? Because they want, it's their great rejuvenation, apparently, as it's called. They need, you know, they need the trade with Europe. You know, you've noticed they've gone on this charm offensive in Europe, trying to. They need the trade. They need to rebuild their economy. The growth rate needs to go up. That kind of thing. So they can't go do what Putin would like them to do. However, that said, there is no way I think that Xi Jinping is going to pull away from Putin. Why? A few reasons. The first thing is the calculus is, what difference does it make if I back away from Putin, if I criticize Russia? It's not going to fundamentally change American policy towards China. American policy is predicated on blocking China's rise, of thwarting its economic power. So why bother sacrificing this very important relationship if nothing fundamentally is going to change with the Americans? That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, China needs the economic trade. They get discounted oil and gas. They get unlimited resources from Siberia. Keep that border stable with Siberia. Keep those resources flowing in to help with Chinese economy. And also, you mentioned Taiwan. If there's a conflict in Taiwan, well, the Russia's there to be an ally and a counterweight and also, Putin's a good boogeyman. It's like, well, he's the bad cop, and China can hide behind it. There's a lot of compatibility between the regimes. The two kinds of regimes are very similar, and so I think that friendship, de facto alliance, as it's often called, will stay.
We've run over time, so I'm going to suggest we take one very last quick question at the back there.
Thank you. I'll try and be brief. I wanted to go back to the 90s. First of all, I would say the roots of Ukraine go back actually into the 90s. I remember going to a press conference when Yeltsin was in at Brize Norton, about to fly out in 1994, September 94. I was working with the BBC. I went with some colleagues from the Ukrainian section, and all the way they were talking about Russia starting a war against Ukraine. And when they asked Yeltsin why he hadn't been to Ukraine, even though he'd been talking about it, he said, "Oh, because of my diary," which they didn't believe for a minute. NATO in the 90s. NATO was invited into Russia. They went to Russia. Specialists from NATO went to Russia again and again and again because Russia was saying, how do we reorganize our army? And NATO was helping them. And this is something that Russians now completely ignore. NATO was the first to open an office in Moscow. It wasn't the other way around. Also, no country, NATO didn't go to any country and say, come and join us. All the countries that joined NATO, it's something the Russians ignore. They joined because they wanted to. And why did they want to? Because they were afraid of Russia. Julie, very quickly, 2 points. You said in 2014, Putin panicked. Putin, on the morning of the closure of the Winter Olympics, Putin signed the order to send the troops into Crimea and then calmly got on a plane and flew down to Sochi. That's not a man who's panicking. Putin had planned that. He didn't panic. And you also said that Russia since then has drifted. No, it hasn't. It hasn't been drifting at all. It's been planning this all along. Finally, for Russia of the future, I've just, please look out for a book, everyone, called A War Made in Russia. It's going to be published in the spring. I know it well because I've just translated it from Russian. And one of the key points of that is what's going to happen in the future, because Russia now is a dreadfully violent society. It's got domestic violence, which isn't punished. It's got violence in schools. It's got violence in the army. It's got violence from the police. Violence goes right through society. We've now got criminals who have been recruited by Wagner, who've had their sentences now abolished, and they're back in society. Some of the worst murderers and rapists in Russian society. Violence is going to play a key issue in whatever the Russia is that follows this.
Do you want the last word, Julie?
No, I mean, I don't disagree with anything you're saying there. I don't, as far as Ukraine in 1991, one of the interesting things, Galina Starovoitova, when she was the advisor to Yeltsin, had said, go ahead and make sure that we have referenda in Donbass and Crimea. Why don't we put those on the agenda to have referenda to see how we would handle that? And of course, at that point, all of them said no. We don't need to be doing that. And of course, we know what happened after that. Starovoitova is no longer living. But had her influence, had her advice been taken, imagine maybe we could have avoided a lot of this, all of this mess. If you would have had certainly a very interesting point. I keep thinking about counterfactuals there. When I say panic, I mean that the fear that somehow NATO, and listening to Russian foreign policy experts over all this time, even they say, look, it looked like many ways NATO would then move into Crimea and take over the Sixth Fleet, in Sevastopol, and you would have NATO replace all that. And by that, even though it was not on the agenda for the West. Nevertheless, my interest is trying to look at it from how they saw it. And I don't think it's all instrumental. I think it was genuine, and that's what I mean by panic. This sense of, oh my God, that NATO is going to be in Ukraine, or if not, as in he began to feel in 2021, Ukraine was, if Ukraine wasn't going to be part of NATO, NATO was going to be in Ukraine. The two were fused. And as I think Primakov said, the idea of NATO near Ukraine was just something that no Russian leader would be able to stomach. So that's what I mean by panic. And certainly, I do think there was a lot of planning. I mean, perhaps, the whole Crimea, someone once described it to me that there was in the file cabinet, there's like what to do if Crimea is under threat. Here's the folder. You do this, and then you invade, you have Donbass, you have the little green men, and, pull out that file as needed. So in that sense, it was planned. But I don't think that this was something that was calculated and deliberately thought. It wouldn't have happened had you not had this action-reaction dynamic that had gone on and on and on, and it didn't have to be inevitable. It wasn't something that was going to happen and in the cards. Certainly, there was a proclivity for it. The pieces were, as you're suggesting, the pieces were all in place for it, but it could have happened. It could have gone different ways. There are a lot of counterfactual history. I can't prove it, but kind of almost can get pretty close to suggesting that it wasn't inevitable.
We've completely overrun our time, so we should probably call this to a close now. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for participating. I found that fascinating. I want to leave, though, everyone with just one thought. It's very, very hard to see anything good or optimistic or positive in any of this. We all know that. I mean, you start by just dispensing with illusions here. But I guess that we're all here because we want a different sort of relationship with a different sort of Russia. So I think there's just something for us to hold on to, that however long it takes, however difficult, messy, tragic the period between now and then is. But let's try and keep a sense of what we actually do want in our relationship with this amazing culture and civilization, despite all the terrible things that its leadership is doing to its neighbors and to its own people. Let's not forget that bit. Thank you.
Yes, Pierre Vimont said we'll have to one day begin thinking how to build security, not just against Russia, as you rightly pointed out, but one day with Russia once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And to our wonderful audience, if you want to keep